I want you to take a moment to think about the subject of racism. And when you hear either the word or when that subject comes up, what emotions come to you? Think about your body sensations. What sensations appear? And as important, and even more importantly, what thoughts come to mind when that subject is broached? Welcome and thank you for joining us for Your Time to Come Alive. My name is Valerie Hope and I am your host. Every week I have the wonderful opportunity to have a conversation to create more consciousness, to help us become even more connected to ourselves and others, and ultimately to create something that we value in this world. I have a wonderful opportunity to speak with interesting people in my lifetime, and today is no different. I have a wonderful guest Dr. Anthony Young. Dr. Anthony and I met, a month ago maybe now, Dr. Young, I think. And both of us were on the panel for the National Society of Minorities in Hospitality webinar. And we had an opportunity to speak a few times since then. And I found him incredibly, or you, Dr. Anthony, so fascinating in not only your knowledge and your experience, but also your approach to life and how your experiences have informed so much of what you do. Aside from being just an interesting person, you're also the past national president of the Association of Black Psychologists. You're the former chairman of the Colorado State Board of Parole, and you're also the current president of the Denver-Rocky Mountain Association of Black Psychologists. Clearly, you're in Denver, Colorado right now, or Colorado Springs, you've corrected me.
Yes.
So thank you so much for saying yes, and welcome to Time to Come Alive. Anything else we should know about you?
Well, it's good to be here, and I'm happy for this opportunity to share some information that might be useful or inspiring to your participants.
I am too. I'll have to admit, straight off the bat, I am a little intimidated by this conversation with you. First of all, because you're so knowledgeable, I feel a little uncomfortable. I'm like, am I going to ask the right questions? We're going to be able to have a good conversation around it. But it's something that I feel so called to do. And I feel also a sense of responsibility by having a conversation that could be really touchy for some people. And there's so much that won't be covered in our topic, I'm sure, in an hour-long session. But if nothing else, my wish is for any one of you, those of you who are listening, is to have an insight, perhaps, that you haven't had before. There's perhaps a question that's answered, or some curiosity that is stoked that will encourage you to drill down even a little deeper. So I just want to acknowledge, first of all, Dr. Anthony, your willingness to have this conversation with me. And you're making it so approachable, because it's big.
For sure.
That's what I do. Sorry?
That's what I do.
Good. That's good. So let's start with that. What is it about the subject of race that's really informed you? How is it that you came to have that as a focus in your teaching and your studies and the work that you do?
Well, first let me say that there's so much misinformation and so much miseducation about the whole issue of race to begin with. All of us grew up with our own ideas based upon our social upbringing and our educational background, but we have a lot of different definitions on what race is, what it is not, and it's convoluted because we find that there's a lot of negative connotations attached to racial issues. Because as Americans, we've never been willing to engage in an authentic conversation about American slavery or the genocide of the indigenous people of this land. So this is really our original sin as a nation. And we don't talk about it. It's like that. It's like what we talk about in the mental health bill sometime about there being an elephant in the room.
Yeah.
The big funky elephant in the room, and you know how elephants can be. They take up a lot of space.
Yeah.
And when you try to live your life without addressing the fact that there's this thing in your house that you have to walk around that you don't want to acknowledge, we find ourselves engaging in a lot of pathological behavior behind that. So the elephant in our room is the whole issue of race
Hmm.
and and its history, because while on one hand, all of us have had American history in elementary school and high school, and no doubt those of us who went to college, you had some history classes, but it did not tell you the whole story. It
Hmm.
taught you the piece that glorifies the people who colonized America. It does not really tell you about the indigenous people who were subjected to genocide or the various other people that came to populate America, their struggles, or about people of African descent who were kidnapped and enslaved. We don't talk about that really in our educational process. So when I was teaching the psychology of diversity at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs for about the last 25 years or so, and when I teach the class, I really go over the psychosocial historical perspective of dealing with an issue such as race in America, because once again, we have a lot of miseducation about it. So when I present the information to my students, oftentimes what I get is that I never heard this before, and I'm upset that here I am, a junior and a senior in college, and just getting this information. So many of my students get upset because they realize they've been cheated in
Hmm.
the educational process. And that there's a lot about fellow Americans that they have no clue about because they were not taught about anything credible regarding people different than themselves. I'm referring to my white students because at the university, most of my students are white.
Hmm.
And they just simply have not come across this type of information before. So when we talk about race, uh, it's something which is very difficult for most Americans to talk about. There's a lot of anger and shame and guilt and grief around that whole concept of race. And before I go any further, let me say that the concept of race itself is really a social construct. Race does not exist in biology. All of us are Homo sapiens sapien, walking, talking, thinking beings, which is basically the meaning of what it means to be a Homo sapiens sapien. There are no races in nature. We have different phenotypes based upon how we look. We have different skin complexion and hair texture and other physiological features, all based upon where people live for thousands and thousands of years, based upon the environment and also the diet that they consume. So we know that after 50,000 years, someone who goes from the equator to the Antarctic would look real different
Hmm.
after about 50,000 years. So this whole concept of race is something which is crazy, and it really provides um, a way for some people to be identified as being inferior or lesser than, and other people as being identified as being superior or better than. So I like to use a standardized definition of racism because that's where I'm going with this. So when we think about racism, that's a very polite word to use. That the real term should be white supremacy. Okay, that is the key to understanding why we have such quote unquote racial issues in America. So I'll give you an operational definition. When I talk about racism slash white supremacy, this is what I'm referring to. It's not just that some individuals like or dislike someone else. That's nothing. That's stupid. That's simply stupid.
Okay.
Um, what I'm talking about is something which is systemic,
Hmm.
something which is deeper than just someone liking or disliking or hating someone else. Um, so let me give you the definition of white supremacy or racism that was coined by Nellie Fuller Jr. And you spell his name Neely Fuller Jr. And you can look him up on the internet, or there are some lectures by him on YouTube as well. But basically, here's a definition for you. White supremacy or racism is the direct or indirect systematic subjugation of non-white people by white people for the basic purpose of pleasing and or serving the interests of white people in all areas of activity, including economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. White supremacy includes, and this is very important, it includes the fundamental belief in the genetic intellectual superiority of white people over all others. This is a worldwide system of belief and behavior.
Hmm.
And
Worldwide.
there's not one institution in America which was not based upon white supremacy. We find that today there are many statues across the country being dismantled and torn down and destroyed of people who really epitomize that notion of white supremacy. And I'm referring to the Confederate generals and heroes, those individuals who were traitors to America, who had statues constructed in their honor years, decades after they had died, to really symbolize this whole notion about white superiority.
Hmm.
When we think about the whole peculiar institution, as it was called, of American slavery, that was it. It was about other human beings being objectified, being seen as non-human, and just as a commodity, something to be used at, at the convenience of the white people who quote unquote own them.
Hmm.
But we have a real hard time putting this in proper perspective because oftentimes my white colleagues can get very upset and very uncomfortable when I bring up the history of race and white supremacy because it's like, well, there's a history that we've been avoiding talking about. And as long as we avoid an issue, and this is very fundamental to psychotherapy, when people are in denial that there's a problem, it's really, really hard to fix it
Mm-hmm.
or for them to heal from their problem because they're avoiding it. One thing that South Africa was able to do that America can take a lesson from is the fact that they had a process that was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. After apartheid ended and white rule ended in South Africa, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission created to allow those people who had done the greatest harm to the nation and to uh, people to actually sit down in front of each other face to face and have a healing process to talk about what was done and to make amends. Something as simple as accepting responsibility and acknowledging wrongs which were done was something that South Africa was able to do. That's why they did not have a bloodbath after apartheid ended. They actually had a healing process for the nation. And that process is not ended. It is still going on.
Mm-hmm.
So America, who have never been willing to address these issues, needs to have a healing process. Our national leaders have been cowards. None of them have been willing to address the issue in any authentic way. And I think that our leaders have had a lack of political will to address the issue of race. And we do know that in this day and age where we're seeing such divisive activities in the media uh, by a person who is our current president, we have to realize that 49% of the people in this country voted for a white supremacist.
Mm-hmm.
Some would say just a white nationalist, but it's all the same thing fundamentally. So we see that there's not only a political divide in the nation, but there's a fundamental humanistic divide in America.
Hmm.
Because white supremacy or racism is really a crime against humanity.
Yeah.
And at its fundamental level, because when you think about some people being exploited, being subjected to predatory capitalism in its worst forms, and that being okay, that's being legal. There's something definitely wrong with this picture. So as a young child, my mother, who had a third grade education, uh, uh, actually she ended up finishing sixth and then eighth grade. Subsequently, when I was uh, still very young, she told us that there was no one in the world who was better than my brothers and I. I'm the youngest of three sons from a single parent household. And she said, there's no one better than you just because of the color of their skin. And we took that serious. She told us as young black boys that we were the descendants of great people. Some of them were kings and queens who have been kidnapped out of Africa, and that we should always be proud of who and what we are because we were the ones who survived the enslavement, that we were the descendants of the people who the enslavers could not kill. And the fact that we exist is proof of the fact that we had to be strong to endure all of those centuries of enslavement and Jim Crow and discrimination in its various forms. So I grew up knowing at a very fundamental level that there was no one better than me just because they were white or any color. Mm-hmm. Because my mother, who had less than a high school education, taught us to have pride in who and what we were, and to also treat other people with all due respect, even though they may have lacked respect themselves.
Dr. Anthony, yes. There's so many things that I want to unpack out of everything you shared. So let's start with one that you mentioned early on. Obviously, as an instructor, a professor at the university, you mentioned that there are topics that come up in your class that your predominantly white students are surprised that they'd not learned before. You said that they feel almost cheated. So what are some of the topics that come up, or what are those lessons that come up that they found so shocking that they hadn't learned about before?
Okay, I'll give you one. There's a wonderful documentary, and this is my first day of class. I show this to all of my students each year, and this helps to stimulate some critical thought. The name of the documentary, and you can get this on the internet, The Shadow of Hate.
Shadow of Hate?
The Shadow, yes, The Shadow of Hate, a history of intolerance in America. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful documentary that talks about the indigenous people, the African people, how Catholics were persecuted in America early on during the days of the colonies. It talks about what has happened with people of Mexican descent in the Southwest, how their land had been stolen, and the various wars which have been fought that actually resulted in America extending from sea to shining sea through the theft of indigenous land and land which was part of Mexico. It talks about how women had been objectified and abused all the way from the time of the colonies. So it's a wonderful documentary that will get people out of their own comfort zone so that they can not just think about other people as being objects, but to actually look within themselves, because documentaries such as these will allow them to begin to engage in some critical thought about subjects that they usually don't think about. And that's the other thing, because as we look at the history which is taught in the media and in the public school, we know that the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education back in the 1950s resulted in the classrooms being desegregated. However, the curriculum was never integrated. That's why you can have people who go through elementary school and high school and college and never, ever hear anything about Africans other than Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. And that in itself is a lie too, because there's more history behind that we don't have time to talk about. But that's just one way. When we think about the origins of Western culture, oftentimes people point to the Greeks as being the foundation for Western thought, and then after the Greeks, the Romans. They totally are oblivious and ignorant of the fact that it was the ancient Kemites, the Greeks called them Egyptians, who actually taught them. And their civilization had lasted for over 3,000 years continuously up until the time of about 325 BC, when Alexander the Great, some people call him, or Alexander the Thief, came into Africa and began to steal from the temples and pillage. And then after that, of course, the Greeks came, then the Romans came, and then the Arabs, and that whole section of Northeast Africa, which is the foundation of Western culture, that had science and law and medicine for thousands of years before Greece ever existed,
Mm.
is really what people have been cheated out of. The real history of Western culture is African,
Mm.
Northeast African, and those people were black.
Yeah. And when your students hear this and they tell you how cheated they felt, how they missed out, what happens after that? They watch the documentary, you have your lesson. What do you notice happens in the conversations? What happens in how they move in the world or they relate to other students?
Well, during the course, they're challenged to look at themselves because while on one hand they're uh, they're they're faced with looking at some of the lies that they've been taught in elementary school and high school and college in a whole different way. So they're able to begin to do some introspection about why they have some of the beliefs about other people who don't look like them. That begins to be challenged, and that's a very good process for them to engage in because without that type of introspection, there is no change.
Mm-hmm.
There's no challenge to what people think that they know, when really the educational process in this country is not so much something which is supposed to illuminate the soul. It is more indoctrination about how to maintain a status quo or a belief system which has not served uh, human beings very well.
Why is that? Why has that penetrated? I mean, I may be asking a real obvious question here, but why has that penetrated the education system to such
Oh,
an extent? Where does
well,
that come
well, well, when you think about why education was, why public school was developed to begin with, it was not for the masses. Okay, to finish high school is something that elite people did, early on because the average child was working, and I'm talking about a couple of centuries ago, 3 centuries ago. So there was no need for public school, in a sense. So only the well-to-do were able to educate their children, and it cost money. When public school came into existence, it was to help to more or less develop a working class. So people who worked in factories and in the industries had a very um, simplistic educational process where they could just provide labor for the people who own the businesses.
from?
So it was not about uh, illuminating the soul or the spirit and getting people to be the best that they could be. We talk about education in very laudable terms these days, but when you look at the root origins of why public school came into existence, it was not to enlighten. It was meant to indoctrinate so that we would have that working class of people. But not only that, we know that education uh, is actually a socializer. So kids are actually socialized into a very Eurocentric belief system, looking at how the curriculum has always been developed for the most part in America. So world history is really European history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are not comparative histories of the various people that occupied the Americas, particularly North America, what we consider the United States of America. There's not a comparative history. What was going on with indigenous people the same time that the colonizers were stealing their land and committing genocide upon them? What was going on with the indigenous people, uh, you know, ever since then, or people of African descent, or people of Asian descent, who had also been in this country for some centuries as well? So we don't hear about them. So
Not at
so
all.
when I talk about the transcontinental railroad, a lot of my students have no idea that a lot of it was built by people who were enslaved, and many people who were enslaved, and they were Asian people,
Mm-hmm.
particularly Chinese, who had been brought here to actually work on the railroads. And many of them died. Thousands of them died during the construction of the the transcontinental railroad. But yet, my students knew nothing about that.
Right.
Another example. So when we think about how historic characters have been glorified in American history, what has been lacking is what is known as the rest of the story. Paul Harvey, journalist some years ago, would have these commentaries on the radio, and he would talk about some facts that some people knew something about, but not a whole lot. And at the end, he would say, well, now you know the rest of the story. So the rest of the story deals with what was going on with other people, other than people of European descent in America.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time that the continent was being made into the United States of America. There's a lot of history there that if you knew what actually happened to people, perhaps some of the historic figures who are worshipped and glorified would be seen in a whole different light if you knew the truth about them. And the Confederate statues are only one example. There are many other historic figures who have been glorified, but yet you look at them, they were people who owned enslaved Africans and who were murderers and rapists. Not only were women raped, but also men were raped during the enslavement. So, in some of these historic figures, you would be taken aback if you knew the whole story.
Wow.
You would ask yourself, why am I holding this person in such high esteem after all that they had done? If people really know the history of Andrew Jackson and some of the other American presidents, you would be horrified to think about, wow, he's the one who marched thousands of indigenous people across the country away from the native land, and many of them died along the way during the Trail of Tears. We don't talk about these things. Why? Because it's an embarrassment. It's horrible. We can, as a nation, gallivant around the planet and talk about democracy and freedom for all, but yet look at what happened right here upon these shores in America. So we have a lot of contradictions that we have to come to terms with. And once again, the only way I believe that we can heal from the racism or the white supremacy that we've been subjected to since America was founded is to have an authentic conversation, maybe a courageous conversation that will make some people feel uncomfortable, but perhaps it's a good thing to get uncomfortable, or should say to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable.
Yes.
Because these are challenging discussions, but there's no healing until we have some healing conversations, really.
I really get that, and what resonates for me is my family is originally from the Republic of Panama, and there were 3 generations born and raised in Panama. And what was interesting is I didn't realize I was Black or that it mattered until I was 14, which I know for some people sounds so crazy, but where we lived in Panama in the city, it was very diverse. So there was no conversation, at least as a child, that I could pick up on around race. And then my dad joined the U.S. military, the Army, and when we immigrated to the U.S., lived and studied in military bases. And again, many of us traveled. Many of us were from different cultures and countries too, so that there was no conversation there. I remember we spent 4 years stationed in Hawaii. Hawaii also very multinational, very diverse state. And then from Hawaii, I started high school, my freshman year in high school in southern Alabama. And we were stationed in Fort Rucker, Alabama. And
oh, wow.
That was a big shock, a big difference. But because there were no high schools on base, those of us who were high school age had to be bused to the local high school. And so my local high school, I remember my first day of school on the bus, got to school. Of course, I was already anxious. There was already, this freshman year. We just moved into town that summer. So all sorts of crazy, anxious thoughts already in my mind. And I remember I happened to sit next to a girl on the bus who happened to be from Panama as well. So she was a senior. So luckily I had an opportunity to kind of connect with her. But when I got to school, I remember my first lunch break came. I walked into the cafeteria and I saw all the Black students sitting on one side of the cafeteria and all the white students sitting on the other side of the cafeteria. I'd never seen that in my life. I'd only seen it on TV. And although it was voluntary, it's all social, I remember feeling so confronted by it. I didn't know what to do, and I thought, okay, I don't know anybody here. No one's going to tell me where to sit just because of the color of my skin. I mean, I had all these thoughts. Of course, I didn't say a word to anybody because I was scared. But there's all these judgments. And luckily, I found that young lady who was the senior who I sat next to on the bus, and I was like, can I sit with you? She was very gracious. No, a lowly freshman got to sit with her. And I remember for the first 2 years of high school, both my freshman and sophomore year, I made myself scarce during lunchtime. I would eat sometimes by myself or sometimes with this the little few friends that I started to make here and there, and then get out of the cafeteria as fast as I could and go hang out in the classroom and read because I didn't know where I fit in. I didn't feel I did. It wasn't until I joined the band in my junior year that, all misfits, the band of misfits that showed up in band, finally felt like I found a place. But what I do acknowledge and recognize is that in my family, at least with my parents and my grandparents who I had contact with, the trauma of racism, the trauma of white supremacy, was not something we were given. We didn't experience in the home, not in a significant way that it came to our dinner table and we had conversations about
Yes.
it. Now, my parents and grandparents may have had their experiences, but nothing that informed, at least I can speak for myself, and my three brothers would say something pretty similar. But what I recognize is coming here, the trauma of the African American is deep, and especially having spent my high school years and my university years in Alabama, in the South, deep South, that was something that was brought up on a regular basis. So I'm curious about how does one begin to confront generations of trauma? I don't have uncles and aunts and grandparents who were lynched or who weren't able to sit in certain counters, or I don't have that personal experience. But in my generation, not likely, African Americans likely had those conversations at dinner, all right? So how do you begin to deal with the trauma that comes with being a product of or exposed to or victim of supremacy?
Well, it's very tough because many parents are not equipped themselves to address the issue with their children. And once again, there's a lot of shame, anger, guilt
Yeah.
regarding that history. So while on one hand, we know that African Americans don't typically have that conversation, it does not come up in public school. If you happen to be Caucasian, it probably does not come up as an educational issue in the home or in public school. And if you're of Asian descent or Native American or of Mexican descent, uh, chances are it may not come up, except when people are subjected to some harm. That comes up because the pain is there, and even though we have this intergenerational trauma uh, as a result of American slavery, we really don't talk about it. But too often times it gets manifested in anger and low self-esteem, depression, so or even substance use. So there's a lot of ways in which people respond to the trauma, but not necessarily in healthy ways, usually in not so healthy ways. So one of the challenges is to have a healing conversation, maybe if you happen to be African American, maybe attend some of the emotional emancipation circles in some of the cities where we hold those. These were created by the Community Healing Network and the Association of Black Psychologists. These are designed to help the descendants of American slavery overcome the trauma associated with that. They're free, but once again, it's something which people of African descent uh, has created as part of our healing process. So they're in Houston, they're in Denver, and Colorado Springs, in New York, and Los Angeles, and many other cities across the nation where we have chapters of the Association of Black Psychologists. We do this as a public service. Now, while on one hand I'm talking about the type of healing process that African Americans have engaged in a bit, but by the same token, white people need to engage in the healing process because they were the perpetuators of these horrible crimes against humanity. While on one hand they're not responsible as individuals themselves, because this happened, decades ago. But yet, uh, the issue of white privilege is real. The issue of discrimination is real. The issue of white supremacy is real. So there's some healing that they need to undergo to address that issue because they were the creators of those type of ills. So they need to confront it. In fact, Tim Weiss and Jane Elliott
Mm-hmm.
and Dr. Robin DiAngelo are wonderful presenters. You can look them up on YouTube. They talk about how white people can address their own healing process. Dr. DiAngelo wrote the text White Fragility, and she actually deconstructs the whole notion of white privilege in such a way that would be easy for most people to not be offended by her approach, or even Tim Weiss or Jane Elliott, who is far more direct. I think
I've
that
seen her, yeah, her stuff.
okay, when people are uncomfortable, it's because they have a reason to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
These are uncomfortable issues to deal with, but they have to get comfortable, feeling uncomfortable so they can heal beyond uh, these struggles that they go through. And by the same token, people who are of Mexican descent, um, I would say of Hispanic descent, but that covers
Yeah.
a lot of area, but particularly here in America, um, there's a healing process that they need to go through. The indigenous people, certainly, they have their rituals which they participate in to help heal. Uh, all people need to engage in this among themselves so that when they find themselves coming in contact with people who are not of the same cultural background, that there's not this pull, this anger, this hate, this frustration, this fear, because fear itself can keep people from from having any type of effective communication. But let me just mention this because this is so important. The issue about white supremacy was it divided people who were white and non-white. People who were non-white were seen as being inferior. They were segregated, given inferior health care, inferior housing, etc., because they were seen as being lesser than. So when we think about not just the issue of equality, because equality is something which um, it's a false notion. And I mention this because in the 50s, during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the original fight was for justice. It was not for integration.
Hmm.
It was not about integrating into white schools or white neighborhoods or being bused into white communities for any reason. It was about having uh, um, justice. Uh, Black people were paying taxes just like white people, so there was no reason for us to have shacks in the South for schools, having to walk past buildings which were uh, uh, strictly for white students. It happened all the time. In fact, my mother told me some stories about how she had to walk to school for 5 miles every day, one way, to get to her school, but she walked past a couple of white schools that she could have easily gone to, but because of segregation, she was not allowed to attend those schools. So the fight was never about equality; it was about justice. And even today, we hear people often say, "Well, we need equality. Equality equal to what?" Is it? It's my question. Do we want, as black people, to be equal to white people? I dare not.
Hmm.
Just justice. What does justice look like? Justice look like there being, at the beginning, perhaps an apology
Hmm.
and a deep conversation, an authentic conversation about all of the harm that has been done by white supremacy, and make amends. If a person is a criminal, and I've worked in the criminal justice system for over 45 years, if a person is a criminal and has been convicted of a crime, we expect for them to take responsibility, to give an apology, and to make amends for whatever it is they've done.
Hmm.
What has happened against black people and indigenous people in this country has been a crime because people have been murdered, raped, mutilated, and and are actually destroyed in a lot of different ways. And our nation has avoided dealing with the issues.
Hmm.
We've had civil rights laws which were never fully implemented. We've had injustice after injustice. We can talk about police brutality, but this type of brutality that happens to people of color psychologically is even worse because we find that when kids are told um, that they're inferior, that they cannot achieve certain goals that they may have in mind just because they're black or because they're brown, or it serves to destroy hope. And when we destroy hope, we actually destroy life. And that is murder. It's a murder of someone's future, someone's potential. That happens too oftentimes as a result of people feeling depressed and self-conscious and of low self-esteem because of a society that teaches them that they're lesser than.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who have a spiritual background or a religious background would say that we're all children of God. You know, whatever God people believe in, you know. But yet, how can that exist and have white supremacy and all of these years of discrimination?
Yeah.
They really are contradictory. So how can you be a good religious person as people claim to be, and yet perpetuate some of the evils?
Exactly.
And white supremacy and racism are just simply evils of our society. So we have a lot of contradictions that perpetuate people being mentally uneased, or obviously mentally diseased, or mentally ill, or mentally unwell. And all of that has to do with how our society socializes people in a way that either they have a false sense of superiority or a false sense of inferiority, and how our society, through education, through the social media, through the various other institutions, perpetuate that. That's the crime that needs to be corrected.
You know, that's, as you're saying this, and you mentioned Jane Elliott earlier, that exercise that she does around blue eyes, brown eyes.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be in an organization called Up With People. Have you heard of Up With
Oh
People?
yes, oh yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I worked with Up With People for 5 years and right out of college. And on 2 occasions in the 5 years that I was working with them, we did that exercise with the group, with the cast.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially the exercise is that all people who have brown eyes are given a green band or some sort of colored armband, and those who had green or blue eyes were given, let's say, red. Right, so they were distinct in just the armbands. Initially, we didn't know what was happening. I participated as well, and we were given the armbands on the bus, and it seemed quite random because we didn't understand why and what they were doing. So those that were in charge of the exercise would give out the armbands according to the eye color. We learned later. We're asked to put the armbands on. And now those of us with brown eyes, or the ones with the green armbands, were asked to get off the bus and go into the whatever location we were in, the cafeteria or the auditorium, and just have a seat. We were accustomed, as we got off the bus, to unload all our luggage and get everything set up before our host families arrived. But they said, no, you don't have to worry about that. Please go straight in and go find a seat. Then those with the red armbands were asked, please, as you come off the bus, go ahead and unload all the luggage. And so immediately people started to react, well, what about them? How come they don't unload their luggage? Why do we have to do it? So you started to hear some rumbling. So that happened. They got off the bus, unloaded the luggage. Those of us with the green armbands go inside. We were asked to sit in the front rows. We're given agendas, handed down, welcome, have a seat, come on. When the people with red armbands came in, find a seat wherever you want. I don't know if we have enough agendas, just share with your partner. And all of a sudden, all these inequity started to be infused into our experience, to the point where during meal times, those with the green armbands were asked to go first in line. And if we were, mixing up with others with red armbands, we were asked by our peers. Eventually, our peers started saying, hey, okay, no, Dr. Anthony, you come with us. You have a green armband. So it started very quickly to the idea of this superiority of the green was really evident. And the part that was most interesting to me is the headiness of it, of having that privilege. We only did the exercise for like 2 days, but during those 2 days, it created such controversy and angst. And there was a feeling of superiority for some, others that in the red armband were also depressed or angry and frustrated, the clash between the two. And it was fascinating. And then obviously we debriefed the exercise and had a conversation about the impact and how that related to discrimination and racism. And it's been 20 plus years now, so I don't remember all the details, but I do remember how quickly we all switched on to the roles that we were assigned. I
That's
can't imagine.
interesting.
Sorry?
That's really interesting. But but think about how people would respond to that century after century
Yes,
after century,
exactly.
being told that you're lesser than, that you have no power, that someone has power over you, who do not have your best interests at heart. So, I mean,
Exactly.
while on one hand, Jane Elliott's experiment is just so powerful, the reality is horrible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you actually find yourself being stigmatized based upon color and not being admitted into certain schools or into certain programs or being able to live in certain areas
Yep.
that you could easily afford, it's like,
Access to certain types of work. Oh, absolutely.
yeah, so through
Absolutely.
and through, you can see how that can be seen as a crime against humanity in terms of how cruel it is.
Yes.
I had a chance to study at a monastery in Taizé, France. It was the Church of Reconciliation. It was an ecumenical church that had people from all over the planet, every country except what were known as Iron Curtain countries from the
Mm.
Soviet bloc, were able to participate. And this was during the summers of 1971 and 1972. I'm giving you an idea about how old I am. And we were able to go there for 12 weeks one summer and 10 weeks the following summer and talk about man's inhumanity to man and what could
Wow.
be done to overcome that. And as a young person, I was only 18 years old when I first went over, and I was placed into a small group. There were about 2,000 people there at this monastery. We lived in tents in this French countryside, not very far from Cluny, France. Uh, and in these small groups, we were of different nations, and I think I was the only American, the only person who didn't speak anything but English.
Hmm.
Fortunately, there were people from South Vietnam and from various European countries and Australia who spoke more than one language, and they could help me deal with conversation because I only spoke English. And regardless of what country they came from, they talked about how people were treated in a very discriminatory way. It could have been because of religion, it could be because of economics, it could have been because of urban versus rural, and the various caste systems that exist in some countries. But there was always some way in which human beings discriminated against other human beings.
Hmm.
And the whole process at the International Council of Youth was to figure out how we could dismantle that, how we could see the humanity within people who don't share our same phenotype, our same economic background, our same cultural or belief system, and to really connect on a very human level. In fact, the Taizé community still exists
Hmm.
uh, in central southern France, and the Church of Reconciliation is still there. And that process really inspired me more so to go into psychology deeper. Now, I might admit that I decided to be a psychologist in eighth grade because I knew the psychologists help people solve problems. And I
Hmm.
have a whole lot of problems of my own, so I figured if I can solve my own, I might be worthy to help someone else. So I
Ah,
didn't go into psychology to help anybody else but me.
yourself. Yeah.
You know, charity starts at home,
Hmm.
healing starts within. So um, going to the Church of Reconciliation and working in that monastery for those 2 summers really gave me a feel for how similar we are in terms of our essence. You know, we want the same thing. You know, regardless of what part of the planet people live on, you want to live in decent places. You want adequate food, and you want love. You want to be respected. So all human beings at that age, I figured out we needed pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
It may have been manifested in various ways, but the bottom line was always the same. So trying to figure out how we could connect with other human beings and dismantle this oppression across the planet is
Yeah.
something that we struggled with. And what we came up with, this is uh, where I'll summarize this, is that as young people, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, sitting on the French countryside from all over the planet, we decided that the best way that we could actually end this man's inhumanity to man, this oppression, was by learning how to change the world. And
Hmm.
we learned how to do it. There were a group of, I think there were 15 of us in my small group, and we learned how to change the world. It was something that was an epiphany for me at that age. So what we decided is that we could change the world by changing our own minds and changing people within our own sphere of influence.
Hmm.
So as we interact with people, we can be that positive force that connects human beings with other human beings in a very real way without this oppressive
Yeah.
mentality, this exploitative mentality, just being able to connect with another human being. And it was wonderful because throughout my personal and professional career, I've been able to connect with people by recognizing and connecting with the humanity within them, the same humanity with is within me as well. So
Hmm.
bottom line, I've
Wonderful.
worked in prisons, I've worked in community mental health centers, I've worked in the state capitol and a lot of other places. But the bottom line is always being able to connect with people without judgment.
Hmm. That's
If we can be
absolutely.
mindful about avoiding being judgmental, because oftentimes what we think we know is false.
Hmm.
People can look at you and have no idea that you were born and raised in Jamaica.
Panama.
You could have just gotten off the airplane
Yeah.
from Ghana,
That's true.
been Ghanaian.
Oh, yeah.
You could have gotten off of the plane from South Vietnam,
Yeah.
and been, Vietnamese. I mean, people cannot tell just by
Can't
looking at you, but being able to have a authentic, non-judgmental conversation is the first step. If we're
Mm.
just able to do that, then perhaps we might be able to engage in some authentic conversations about our healing uh, as individuals, but also culturally,
Mhm. So,
and perhaps as a nation.
Dr. Anthony, I'm curious about, so you mentioned healing, the process of healing and how everything starts from healing oneself, right?
Yes.
Healing myself. What is what is feeling healed? What is healing, or what does it feel like to be healed when it comes to something like racism or
Oh,
having experienced white supremacy, either as a perpetrator or as a victim of it? What would the healing experience feel like?
well, I've never been a perpetrator of racism, so I have no clue about that
Well, in
personally.
general, how does one know they're healed, in other words, from
Well, I say
anything?
that I would say it's a process.
Hmm.
It's not a destination; it's a process. It's almost like when have you arrived?
Hmm.
When have you become woke? It's, it is a process.
Sure.
It is a dynamic, ongoing process, and incrementally, people begin to realize some things about themselves that they didn't know.
Mm.
They begin to have that aha moment and begin to realize that, well, maybe I can rethink this. Now that I have more information that I can add to my repertoire, I can look at this situation, this problem from another perspective and grow from that. And that growth in itself is healing. When people don't grow, they stay stagnant, and we know the stagnant things die or they're dead. So, what does healing feel like? You'll know it when you feel it because it feels good. And the light bulb goes off, or should say, goes on in your head that says, now I see.
Mm. Now I see.
Yeah.
I would add to that, I feel a sense of peace, those moments where I found healing. Like there's the anxiety you mentioned earlier, to be comfortable feeling uncomfortable, right?
Hmm.
And I think the more comfortable we become with discomfort, the more we can hold the space for ourselves or for others in those uncomfortable moments. That's also a sign, I would say, that someone is in the process of healing. And
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
You can connect with someone else. But
exactly.
as long as we're not healing, we're being defensive. We
Yes.
have to protect the sick ego that we've developed around white supremacy.
Mm.
And the pain that people have suffered from, we have to guard against that. We have to protect ourselves from experiencing more pain. So the whole process is something which takes a lot of weight off of you once you can effectively engage in it. But It requires an awful lot of introspection, and you have to be willing to look at yourself honestly.
Mm.
And that's hard for most people. It's easier to look in the mirror and look at all of the beautiful things that we like about ourselves and totally ignore the ugly bits, the part we want to change, the part that we are stuck on stupid with.
Stuck on stupid.
Yeah, SOS. Yeah, and, we all have those pieces that we're not proud of, as some people would say.
I like stuck on stupid better.
And being
I've
able
found some of
to,
those in my.
oh yeah, we all
Yeah,
have them.
we all have them. You're right.
So,
In the last few moments that we have, Dr. Anthony, what I know one of the things we talked about is you have an abundance of resources that you found really helpful, instrumental. You've mentioned a few already. Any other resources or any other experiences that would be really healing for people that you'd like to call out?
mm, I'll send you a list.
Perfect. I will make sure I add it to the show notes so people have access to it.
Okay,
But here's
but
a
what I
good.
would like, what I would like to say is that in this process, we have to be willing to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not just the part that makes us feel comfortable and proud that we
Mhm.
like. We have to look at all of it if we're truly interested and willing to engage in the healing process. And that's not just individually, that's collectively. As a nation, we need to be willing to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of our history
Mhm.
and come to terms with that. Because by coming to terms with those issues, we will actually find ourselves being willing to connect with other people on a humanistic basis.
Hmm.
And we can actually engage in the healing conversation once we're able to look at the totality rather than just the part that we like to look at because it makes
Absolutely.
us feel good.
You know what's been fascinating just over the last few weeks? I've had some very interesting conversations with people. One in particular, I want to shout out to Cindy Sue, who used to be in Up With People with me back in the day, and she and I have connected on Facebook recently about her role as a school teacher. She's in Canada, but as a school teacher, one of the things that she's now really committed to is educating herself and those that she is responsible for on all things. So she's white, she's Caucasian, but one of the things that she purchased recently was a set of flashcards that are all about African contributions, people of African descent, and the contributions to history, to science, to society, in essence, to educate herself and to educate others. And what I found really interesting in our exchanges, how she's in the process of discovering, right, doing that
Mhm.
introspection, like you mentioned,
Mhm.
and discovering ways in which she's been teaching information that completely that didn't acknowledge other areas. So just a shout out to her, and I know there are many others out there that are doing some of the work, and perhaps she might be another guest on the show. Just a hint there, but I do think that not only enough. In my experience, I feel it's not only enough to read the books or watch the documentaries. That if they don't make a change, or we don't implement the things that we learn into our own lives, into our
Mhm.
own conversations, into our own relationships, and how we continue to educate and share that information with others.
And that is certainly the goal because it's one thing to engage in introspection, but you have to be able to apply it.
Yeah.
But we start with ourselves. One of the worst things we can do is walk up to another person and ask, "What does it feel like being black?" Or "What does it feel like being white?" You know, that's totally crazy. Rather than asking them, ask yourself, what does it feel like being in your skin and
Yeah.
having your history? You have to start with yourself rather than reading a book, 100 things that you always wanted to ask about black people but were afraid to ask. You don't start there, you start with yourself. If you're white,
Yeah.
look at the work of Dr. Robin DiAngelo and Tim Weiss and Jane Elliott and people like that who have actually done the work to wake themselves up. You can wake yourself up in the same manner, but you have to start with yourself. For
Mm.
those of us who are of African descent, look at the work of Dr. Kobe Kamon, Wade Nobles, Dr. Nobles, and some of the others, Dr. Linda James Myers, and begin to grapple with these issues, or Dr. John Henry Clark, or Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who's from Guyana. Wonderful writers who told the truth.
Mm.
without glorifying or mystifying or romanticizing our history and our culture. Look at people who have done credible work. There's a lot of garbage out there, so you have to be able to use some critical judgment about what you ingest, because you don't want to ingest the unhealthy stuff because they'll just make you sicker.
Mm-hmm.
So just be very mindful about getting some credible sources so that you can actually do the work that's required. Otherwise, you stay SOS.
Stuck on stupid. And on that note, wonderful. Dr. Anthony Young, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for the knowledge that you shared with us today. I'm really grateful to have begun my own journey, right, in having these types of conversations and really not only discovering for myself what it takes to have a conversation like this, that not only I hope helps and heals and creates insights for others, but also for me and how I move in the world and my responsibility as a citizen and as a coach. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
You're very welcome for engaging in a courageous conversation.
Courageous conversation, number one. Many more to come, I'm sure. You might be asked to come back again later on, perhaps with some additional insights. So I really appreciate your generosity of your time today. And like I said, I'll include whatever additional resources you have and those that you've already mentioned with names and links if possible, so that way those of you who've been listening and watching have an opportunity to explore on your own and reflect for yourself. Dr. Anthony, thank you so much again for being a part of Time to Come Alive. Please, those of you who are watching and listening, subscribe to timetocomealive.com if you want to receive this and other episodes in your inbox. If you are a YouTube fan, go to Connect to Joy YouTube channel and you can subscribe there to receive notifications whenever a new video is posted. Either way, we want you to stay engaged and stay connected. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Anthony.
You're welcome. Bye.